Leiningen is the name of an old German noble family whose lands lay principally in Alsace, Lorraine and the Palatinate. Various branches of this family developed over the centuries, and a number of those still exist, including the branch of the Princes of Leiningen. Origins. The first Count of Leiningen about whom anything definite is known was of certain Image II, whose family became extinct in the male line when Count Frederick, a Minnesinger, died about 1220. Frederick's sister, Lugarde, married Simon II, Count of Saarbrücken, and Frederick, one of the sons, inheriting the lands of the Counts of Leiningen, took their arms and the name. History. Having increased its possessions, the Leiningen family was divided around 1317 into two branches. The elder of these, whose head was a landgrave, died out in 1467. Upon this event, its lands fell to a female, the last landgrave's sister Margaret, wife of Reinhard, Lord of Westerberg, and the descendants were known as the family of Leiningen-Westerberg. Later this family was divided into two branches, those of Old Leiningen-Westerberg and Neue Leiningen-Westerberg, both of which are represented today. Meanwhile, the younger branch of the Leiningens, known as the family of Leiningen-Hardenberg, was flourishing. On the 27th of June 1560, this branch was divided into the lines of Leiningen-Dagsburg-Hardenberg, founded by Count Johann Philipp, and Leiningen-Dagsburg-Heidsheim of Falkenberg, founded by Count Emicho. In 1779, the head of the Leiningen-Dagsburg-Hardenberg line was raised to the rank of a Prince of the Holy Roman Empire with the title of Prince of Leiningen. In 1801, this line was deprived of its lands on the left bank of the Rhine by France, but in 1803 it received ample compensation for these losses. A few years later, its possessions were mediatized, and they are now included mainly in Baden, but partly in Bavaria and in Hesse. The second prince of the Leiningen-Dagsburg-Hardenberg line, Prince Image Charles, married Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. After his death in 1814, the princess married Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, a younger son of George III, by whom she became the mother of Queen Victoria. Since 1991, the head of the princely line has been Prince Andreas. In 2013, Prince Karl Image converted from Lutheranism to Eastern Orthodox Christianity and now claims to be the major pretender to the former Russian throne, according to the pre-revolution fundamental laws of the Russian Empire. Because of his Russian monarchical ancestors such as Grand Duchess Maria Kirillovna and Alexander II of Russia, the family of Leiningen-Dagsburg-Heidsheim was divided into three branches, the two senior of which became extinct. At present, it is represented by the Counts of Leiningen-Guntisblum and Leiningen-Heidsheim, also called Leiningen-Billigheim and Leiningen-Neidenau. Line of descent. Note that different sources use different sequence numbers for some of the counts. For consistency across sources, dates of birth and death are useful. Earliest Counts Emicho of Leiningen helped lead the German Crusade, 1096. His relationship to the others is unclear. Image was Count of Leiningen in 1127, but it is unclear when he died, or his relation to the other counts. Image II is attested as Count of Leiningen in documents from 1143 to 1179. His son, Friedrich I, had taken over the county by 1189. Image III is attested as Count of Leiningen in documents from 1193 through 1208, though it is unclear his relationship to the previous counts. Friedrich II, cousin of Image III, was recorded as junior count under Image in 1205, and as count in his own right from 1210 to 1217. A document from 1220 refers to his widow. Saarbrücken line Simon II, Count of Saarbrücken, married Lugaud, the heiress of Leiningen, whose descent from the original Counts of Leiningen is unclear. The son, Friedrich III, inherited the county of Leiningen. His son, Simon, married Gertrude, heiress of the county of Dagsburg, bringing that property into the family. Friedrich IV, son of Friedrich III, was attested as count in documents from 1239 and 1249, and married Adelheid of Kyburg. The son, Friedrich V, whose sons divided the county into Leiningen, Dagsburg, and Leiningen-Hartenberg. Image IV, brother of Friedrich IV, ruled a portion of the lands at Leiningen-Landeck. His son, Image V, Count of Leiningen-Landeck, had no heir. Agnes married Otto I, Count of Nassau. Leiningen-Dagsburg. Friedrich VI, son of Friedrich V, became Count of Leiningen-Dagsburg. Friedrich VII, Count of Leiningen-Dagsburg. Friedrich VIII, Count of Leiningen-Dagsburg, married Jolanda of Jülich, granddaughter of Gerhard V of Jülich. Jolantha. Her descendants include the lords of Egmont and the dukes of Gelders. Friedrich IX, Count of Leiningen-Dagsburg. Margaret, daughter and only heir of Friedrich IX, married Reinhard III, Lord of Westerberg. Leiningen-Westerberg. Kuno I, Lord of Westerberg, was the son of Margaret and Reinhard. Reinhard I, Count of Leiningen-Westerberg, inherited the county from his mother. Kuno II, Count of Leiningen-Westerberg. Philippine, Count of Leiningen-Leiningen. George I, Count of Leiningen-Schaumburg. Reinhard II, Count of Leiningen-Westerberg. Albrecht Philipp, Count of Leiningen-Westerberg. Johann Ludwig, Count of Leiningen-Westerberg, last of this branch. This county was then absorbed into Leiningen-Schaumburg. Leiningen-Leiningen. Philippine, Count of Leiningen-Leiningen, son of Kuno II, Count of Leiningen-Westerberg. Ludwig, Count of Leiningen-Leiningen, married Bernardine of Lippe. Johann Casimir, Count of Leiningen-Leiningen. Philip II, Count of Leiningen-Leiningen. Ludwig Eberhard, Count of Leiningen-Leiningen, married Charlotte, daughter of William Louis, Count of Nassau. Saarbrücken. Philip Ludwig, Count of Leiningen-Leiningen. Ludwig Image, Count of Leiningen-Leiningen. Johann Ludwig, Count of Leiningen-Leiningen. This branch ended in 1705, and this county was also absorbed into Leiningen-Schaumburg. Leiningen-Schaumburg. George I, Count of Leiningen-Schaumburg, son of Kuno II, Count of Leiningen-Westerberg. Philip Jacob, Count of Leiningen-Schaumburg. Reinhard II, Count of Leiningen-Schaumburg. Christoph, Count of Leiningen-Schaumburg. Margaret Elizabeth married Frederick I, Landgrave of Hesse-Homburg. Philip Ludwig, Count of Leiningen-Schaumburg. George Wilhelm, Count of Leiningen-Schaumburg. Johann Anton, Count of Leiningen-Schaumburg. George Friedrich, Count of Leiningen-Schaumburg. Christoph Christian, Count of Leiningen-Altleiningen. George II, Karl Ludwig, Count of Leiningen-Neuleiningen. Leiningen-Altleiningen. Christoph Christian, Count of Leiningen-Altleiningen, son of George Wilhelm, Count of Leiningen-Schaumburg. George Hermann, Count of Leiningen-Altleiningen. Christian Johann, Count of Leiningen-Altleiningen. Christian Karl, Count of Leiningen-Altleiningen. Friedrich I, Ludwig Christian, Count of Leiningen-Altleiningen. Friedrich II, Edward, Count of Leiningen-Altleiningen. Caroline Leiningen-Westerberg. Johann Ludwig Friedrich III, Wipprecht Franz, Count of Leiningen-Altleiningen. Gustav Friedrich Oscar, Count of Leiningen-Altleiningen. Leiningen-Neuleiningen. George II, Karl Ludwig, Count of Leiningen-Neuleiningen, son of George Wilhelm, Count of Leiningen-Schaumburg. George Karl I, August Ludwig, Count of Leiningen-Neuleiningen. Karl II, Gustav Reinhard Waldemar, Count of Leiningen. Ferdinand Karl III, Count of Leiningen. August George Gustav, Count of Leiningen. Christian Franz Seraph Vincenz, Count of Leiningen. George Ernst Ludwig Karl IV, Joseph Philip Ludwig Ernst, Count of Leiningen. George Karl August, Count of Leiningen. Wilhelm, Count of Leiningen. Gottfried's other son became Image V, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg. Image V, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg, married Beatrix Zaringen, daughter of Bernard I, Margrave of Baden. Image 7, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg. Image 8, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg. Katharina married Philip II, Count of Nassau-Saarbrücken. Image X, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg. Image X, Count of Leiningen-Dagsburg. Johann Philipp Hahn, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg. Image 12, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg, married Marie of Wittelsbach, daughter of Wolfgang, Count Palatine of Zweibrücken. Johann Philipp II, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg, married Elizabeth of Leiningen-Dagsburg, daughter of Image X. Friedrich Image, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg. Marie Polixena married John Ernst, Count of Nassau-Weilburg. Image 14, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg, married Charlotte Sophie of Baden-Durlach, daughter of Margrave Charles Magnus of Baden-Durlach. Johann Friedrich, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg, married Katharina of Baden-Durlach, daughter of Frederick VII, Margrave of Baden-Durlach. Friedrich Magnus, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg. Karl Friedrich Wilhelm, 1st Prince of Leiningen, Leiningen-Dagsburg. Image X, Count of Leiningen-Dagsburg, son of Image X, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg. Elizabeth married her great-nephew Johann Philipp II, Count of Leiningen-Hartenberg. Philip George, Count of Leiningen-Dagsburg. Anna married John, Count of Nassau-Idstein. Johann Ludwig, Count of Leiningen-Dagsburg. Falkenberg. Image 13, Count of Leiningen-Dagsburg. Falkenberg. Juliana Alexandrine married George III, Landgrave of Hesse and Charles, Landgrave of Hesse-Wanfried. Image Christian of Leiningen-Dagsburg. Elizabeth Dorothea Wilhelmine married Moritz Hermann of Limburg. George William, Count of Leiningen-Dagsburg. Falkenberg. John, Count of Leiningen-Dagsburg. Falkenberg married Countess Johanna Magdalene of Hanau-Lichtenberg. Christian Karl Reinhard of Leiningen-Dagsburg. Falkenberg. Heidsheim. Countess Caroline Felicitas of Leiningen-Dagsburg. Countess Maria Louise Albertine of Leiningen-Falkenberg. Dagsburg.